Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel on 50 years of season 8. So, of course, this was, 20 years before I was born, of course. It's nowhere near where I was born. So we have some fine panelists today who you may have seen in some other panels. So let me go around in the order that's on my screen. Michael Rogers, would you like to start?
Hi there. My name's Michael Rogers. I've been a Doctor Who fan since 1982, I think, when my mom forced me to sit down and watch Robot with Tom Baker, and she still hasn't apologized yet. I harbor ill will over that because it changed my life. I love the Pertwee era. Love season 8, so I'm just excited to be here and to be part of the conversation tonight. So,
cool. Zecca?
Yeah, this is Michael Zecca. I have been watching since '81, and I usually tell people that my favorite Doctor is Colin, my favorite era is Pertwee, and my favorite season is Troughton's middle season 5.
Cool. Chris? You're muted.
Hello, I'm Chris Bahn. I have been a fan of Doctor Who since 1975. I debuted the same year as season 8. It was a long time to be a Doctor Who fan. I used to write about the show for the AV Club for a few years, and so that's my connection to the show.
Cool. And Arnold?
I'm Arnold Blumberg. I run ATB Publishing, where we publish, in addition to lots of other pop culture nonfiction, books on Doctor Who, like the Outside In series, or volumes on that, Red, White, and Who. I've been a fan since roughly 86, 87. And hearing all the initial celebration of the 50th anniversary of season 8 in The Master was my first reminder this year that this is my 50th anniversary year, and it's surely going to be pummeled into me by every successive 50th antoversary that rolls out. So I'm looking forward to that all year long.
Yeah, when the panels make you feel old, it's tough. Yeah, so my name is Stacy Smith. I am an author and editor. So I edit the Outside In series. I write books like this with Graham Burke. I have written under the name Robert Smith, but I recently changed to Stacey. And so, yes, I actually, Chris, I'm impressed. You have me beat. I'm slightly later than you. I think it was 76 for me. So yes, a little bit later. But yes, so I guess we've been watching this for a while now. Even those late comers who came in the 80s. So yeah, it's been 50 years. So why is season 8 worth celebrating 50 years later?
And we're done.
I guess I'll start with something we were talking about before the panel. Season 6, toward the end with Troughton, was having a lot of issues behind the scenes. And then season 7 was very experimental. It was the first year in color. It was the first year basing the show on Earth. And they were really trying to kind of find their feet. And even if you look at the title sequences in season 7, they still do some of the experimental things they were doing in season 6, like with the titles in Inferno. But with season 8, we really kind of launched the unit family era. We already had the Brigadier and Sergeant Benton, but we pick up Joe Grant, Captain Yates, the Master, and really just a kind of general feel that continues through the rest of the Pertwee run, and really in some ways through the rest of the 70s. This is the launching point.
And like Mike is saying, there's also, he said unit family, and of course that's the term that I think most of us who particularly love that era think of too. In some ways it's also been used as a bat to beat that era from time to time. But definitely one of my favorite eras of the whole show in general, and probably my favorite single season of that era. But all the things he said, And in addition, such a striking change of tone, if you were watching, to go from this stark, much more serious argument. I mean, I say serious, there are guys in rubber suits as lizards walking around, but you know what I mean? There was an attempt to create a sense of gritty realism in the midst of the insanity in 7 that 8 does not worry with. 8 has a warmth and a jovial kind of atmosphere to it, even in its darkest moments.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is attributed to the master-doctor relationship, but it's that I think also draws a lot of us back to it. It's a comfortable time for the show in many respects. And you feel that although the Doctor's in exile, he's ultimately not nearly as unhappy about it as he sometimes seems to indicate that he is. And it's a warmth that I always think of.
Yeah. Season 7 was, in some ways, arguably it's the strongest season of the classic series. I don't know that I would necessarily argue that, but I could see an argument being made. But season 8, where they kind of pull back from the new direction and sort of bring it back, tie it together with what the classic series had done beforehand, I think it really sets a tone that was very consistent for the rest of Pertwee's era, for sure, and keeps going into the modern day. The 7th season was an anomaly in a lot of ways, and the 8th season is today's Doctor Who in ways that season 7 aren't.
Yeah, I would say it's quintessential Pertwee. Like season 8 is the poster child of the Pertwee era, because of course you've got the heavy unit influence, you have the Master there, you have all of the regulars, you have a little bit of off-world adventures with Colony in Space.
Mm-hmm.
You get a little bit of TARDIS action in Paws of Axos. So you get a little bit of everything, and of course lots of Earthbound stories. So to me, it's just like, if you wanted to pick any kind of Pertwee era story, just pick one from season 8, and you've got all of those great elements put to full functional use there. And with Barry Letts, the producer, and Terrence Dix, the script editor, like firing on all cylinders. It's just a great season.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love season 7. To me, that is some really, really high quality Doctor Who. But like in season 7, Doctor Who was really under the gun. Like it was basically about to be cancelled, and there was really no talk of cancellation after season 8 again till like late into the 80s, right? And so it's basically, I think season 8 is what saves Doctor Who. Like, and I think had season 8 not kind of come along and kind of really grabbed an audience, like the audience was kind of somewhat there for season 7, but like boy did season 8 really build on that. And I think that having a cohesion, I guess like we were saying with with the family, and it's funny because when you mention the family, you always throw in the Master. You're like, oh yeah, that wacky old uncle of ours who just always trying to blow up the world, but he's one of us.
He was supposed to be the Doctor's brother, right? So
yes, that's right.
I'm still holding on to that right to the end.
Yeah. So I guess it's also the first time that you really try this sense of unity in a season for Doctor Who. This is very unusual, and this is, I would say, has a lot more in common with today's television, where you have like season-long arcs and stuff. Whereas at the time, it just seemed like, here's the Master again.
I was going to say this really was kind of like the first arc season with the Master as the recurring villain in every story. The rest of the
interesting, actually, you look at it that way. Yeah, because like I said, I guess it's the defensive quality of being a fan. It's like for so many years, I've dealt with periods of time where we seem to go through these periods where people turn against the Pertwee era and there are legitimate reasons to look at Pertwee's Doctor and say there's some interesting issues there in relation to the Doctor as a larger character. He's very establishment for someone who then also bucks against the establishment very often. Things like that. But I remember like all the time everybody always say, oh, but season 8's so predictable. The Master shows up in every damn story no matter what. It's like, yes, but if you look at it as an arc, then it makes sense, because now it's no longer individual stories. We are heading toward a final confrontation and eventually a temporary resolution with him by the end of the season. So yeah, it's really prescient actually how much that season works in terms of a modern sensibility.
Yeah, if the greatest criticism is too much Delgado,
Yeah.
you're doing okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess to what extent do we think that, like, did season 8 suffer from the flaws that kind of Arnold mentioned of the Pertwee era?
There are flaws in the Pertwee era.
Actually, I'm going to say there's only one flaw in the Pertwee era. For me, it's Jon Pertwee. Everything else I adore. I think the Exile to Earth arc is brilliant. I think the Unit family are amazing. The companions are really like kind of well done. Like, Jo Grant seems like she's going to be this kind of like weird kind of ditzy kind of like, companion, yet she's doing really interesting things and so on. And I find, except for the Doctor himself, this is an amazing era. I may well be alone in that. That's fine.
What are your concerns with Pertwee? What is it that stands out that you say that?
I mean, partly I find he's a weaker actor than a lot of people around him. I mean, Delgado shows up everyone, of course. I think he's in general not a very likable Doctor, with a few notable exceptions. Like, he sort of have his moment of charm in an episode, but he's very rude to a lot of people. He's not kind of that easy to really love, I think. At least that's what I find. And he was my first Doctor too, but I just find like he's sort of like a Doctor on the spectrum a bit. Like, he's really not kind of fitting in well in ways that he should be. And I think in some cases it has real ramifications on the story. Like, Doctor and the Silurians would be over 4 episodes earlier if he'd just been nicer to Quinn, stuff like that. And and he's really rude to the Brigadier all the time. And yet he doesn't care. He's just like, yeah, whatever. It's like, oh, that wacky guy.
It is interesting that I've always seen it as one of like I keep saying warm, but that's the one word that I think, like, you have a tone meeting, warmth. Is the thing that, and I will say also that it was like the one era and the one Doctor that my mother most loved, and we really bonded together on watching Pertwee stories over and over again, and that really was something she loved. But in watching them with Natalie, with my wife, who had seen so few of these, she was struck by exactly what you're saying about he's a very rough-edged character. And I think I'm bringing to it so much nostalgia and a sense of comfort with him that when you're coming to it new, you can see a bit more that he's a very contentious character. And like you say, very rude to everyone. But I think that's the way he is often, so.
Just a jumping point from there, which takes us a little outside season 8, but there was a sharp contrast between Hartnell and Troughton when they did that regeneration. They wanted to make him very different, and they kind of did that again, going Troughton to Pertwee. And I think this has cycled. If you look, every Doctor Divisible by 3 has been kind of brusque, rude, standoffish. I mean, it applies to Colin Baker, it applies to Christopher Eccleston, and it applies to Peter Capaldi as well.
Tom Baker could be extraordinarily brusque.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in there in the warp and woof and weave of the character.
Yeah.
I think for me, Pertwee, his character, the third Doctor's character, I struggled with that also, the unlikability part. Although, in general, I'm on his side. I find him charming, but there's plenty of times when he's not, and he's rude in ways that are not called for and not helpful in any way. And I thought about, why would he possibly do that? What's going on with his character? And for me, I like to think of it that the third Doctor was so distraught at what the Time Lords did to him in the War Games, that he's just desperate for some kind of, I think of him as like the teenager version of the Doctor, where he's desperate for validation that he is important enough and worthy enough to be part of the establishment. But he really doesn't want to be part of it. He really wants to be what the fourth Doctor becomes, which is the big bohemian character that's above all of it. The third Doctor has a huge inferiority complex to me.
Actually, I love this idea of he's the Doctor as a teenager because he's grounded.
Yeah.
He's really upset about it.
Exactly. They took his car away.
I think it's a beautiful way of looking at it, and it also fits very neatly with one of my all-time favorite little slices of modern Doctor Who. Is perfect for this console room event is Time Crash with Tennant and Peter Davison, and there's that great moment where Tennant tells Davison's doctor, I used to try to pretend to be all old and serious and everything like you do when you're young, and then I was you. Which means that the ones prior to him are the youthful incarnations trying to be serious and not, and that fits perfectly with that conception of Pertwee. So it's a beautiful way of looking at it. If you look at the whole arc of the character, this is youth still at that point.
And Pertwee is very into tech.
Yep.
he likes hot rods. So yeah, that's right.
So we have a question from the chat from Ultramat, which says, were there any aspects from season 7 that you think they could have kept for season 8? I guess aspects they didn't keep, I suppose.
Yeah, because they certainly did carry over quite a bit, at least in terms of unit.
Yeah, I mean, Liz Chill would have been great, but yeah.
I would have liked to see more of Liz, and yeah. I mean, I'm glad that Joe shows up, but
yeah,
or maybe at least a farewell scene at the beginning or something.
Yeah.
Or something they could do in the modern era that they didn't do then, and again it comes down to production reasons really, but to have her occasionally pop back as a guest star, to provide science support where needed, because she was really more of a peer with the Doctor in some respects, where Joe was definitely an assistant.
Well, I mean, Liz is really screwed over because she's supposed to be the scientific advisor.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She goes up, and it's like, all right, now you're my assistant.
Yeah.
So and you're right. In a modern context, you wouldn't have been surprised for her to turn up again.
Yeah.
But
to put it in a modern university science lab sense, though, Liz kind of got demoted to postdoc. Joe's not even a grad student.
Although I think Joe's introduction had they put potential into that character for her to be more than they really bothered to develop. She had that whole thing where she was supposed to be kind of a spy and a kung fu star that they pretty quickly dropped. And while I love the relationship that she and Pertwee have, evolving into kind of a father-daughter sort of thing toward the end, to me, it came at the cost of her being childlike in some ways, and less grown up as a character than she started out having the potential to be.
Well, going back to the thing we were saying about season 8 feeling like a modern story arc in some respects, there's also the character of Joe starting in season 8, and although that's true, it is interesting that when you look back, considering how little they would take a companion character and give them the sort of emotional and personality arc that we've now come to expect in modern storytelling, Joe is one of the rare cases where she kind of did get that. Because if you watch her whole arc, she goes from the ditzy one who starts the fire and is like really wants to be, pleasing him and is not, totally up on her game, and becomes the one, and we talked about this a bit last night in the master panel, becomes the one who learns from her first experience with him, fights him and wins, resists his hypnotic power. And then eventually, although granted, this is cliche in its own way, you marry a character off and they go away, but marries a character who she sees as a doctor figure that she can relate to as a peer as well. And she's got a mission and everything. It's quite a modern arc in terms of what we're used to today that you wouldn't see in the old show that often. And it's pretty nice. So yeah.
There's also some modernity in the arc with the Master's relationship with her as well. He develops a grudging respect for her based on the fact that she is able to resist him. When he runs into her in like Frontier in Space and such, there's some respect there that you don't always see with other companions with the Master.
Yeah, and we also mentioned Yates is coming in.
Yeah,
and my God, the art he gets is fascinating too, from the perspective of what they wouldn't normally do in the show back then. he gets quite a transformation by the end. And
it's such a long game too, right? Because it's not like he's brought in and then by the end of the season he's he's betrayed them and stuff. It's years long. Yeah.
So this is the beginning of a lot of interesting stuff for the classic show that feels very forward thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because he's sort of brought in to be like Joe's love interest, but they don't really develop it aside from a few hints here and there. And she's supposed to be on a date with him and Costa Peladon and stuff like that. But like it doesn't really go anywhere. And I think that's really because the chemistry between the Doctor and Joe is so strong that like you kind of don't really need a romantic lead when you have this kind of chemistry working.
Yeah, thank goodness they backed off because it really wasn't needed.
Yes. Also, possibly Mike Yates is not the most believable romantic lead for Joe Grant.
There is that too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think throwing Mike Yates in also gives a structure to unit, right? So suddenly it's not just like two guys, right? There's like, there's now there's a proper hierarchy. Yes, there's three, but it's it's sort of like, well, in like the armed forces kind of thing, like normally like a sergeant would not be talking to a brigadier, like it's just like the gulf is huge there, really, and like it's like, oh well we like this guy, so
Well, we had unit captains prior to this in the invasion, and of course
that's right,
and the Silurians, but we just hadn't had that recurring thing. It was just kind of a guest star of the week each time when we needed an officer at that level. But now we actually have a regular go-to person. This is who the troops like Benton are reporting to. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, then we start to get other, recurring, like less so, but like, there's Palmer and Osgood and stuff like that.
Corporal Bell.
Corporal Bell and like, so names that start popping up again and again. Even if, the grand total maybe two or something for each of them, at least they're kind of not just one-offs. And,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do we think about the kind of, guest stars like Chin or something like that, like these, random officious kind of people who are coming in from the ministry to like, tell the Doctor what to do.
Go ahead on the block, Chin.
To me, that's like perfect. The perfect antagonist to the third Doctor persona, right? He's there to drink Merlot and kick ass, and he's all out of Merlot. But I love when he pops off at the bureaucrats and the people that are standing in the way of whatever it is that he needs to get done.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. There's this weird sort of dichotomy there with Pertwee's Doctor. He's arguably the most establishment Doctor ever, and seems very comfortable with the perks that come with privilege. And I'm always thinking, this isn't 8, but I'm thinking like Day of the Daleks and sitting around with the sandwiches and sardonic
wine and cheese and
But at the same time, he will be the first one to take down a stuffed shirt who shows up from the ministry or some scientist running something that he knows is misguided. And he's arguably one of the most confrontational when it comes to authority. So it's a weird blend, but I think it kind of works really great with Krista's idea of the teenager aspect of it. And it's like, well, he wants to pretend to be that guy, but he also doesn't respect anyone else in position of authority. And he's usually right, with whoever he's facing.
It's funny because he sort of, like he acts like this like diplomat and negotiator, and he's terrible at both, right? He can't hobnob with the people he should be hobnobbing with because he gets frustrated with them and basically yells at them too quickly, and he can't kind of like find this middle ground because he's like, no, I'm just right, and
and he speaks really odd Chinese from what I understand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And the other thing,
you learned it by watching Firefly.
Yeah. The other thing about that whole aspect of the teenageriness, I think the thing that may have even made me think that in the first place is, why is he on Earth? Because the Time Lords put him there to learn how to be. That's basically what they told him at the end of the War Games. We don't want you to stop adventuring. We want you to become better at adventuring. So we could put you in a prison. We could disintegrate you. No, we're going to trap you on Earth at a time when it's under constant threat of alien invasion. So you're going to learn how to work with other people to stop them. And whether or not that actually works out the way the Time Lords wanted is arguable. It's the Fourth Doctor works with people even worse than Pertwee does in many ways.
And then they also starts using him as an agent. So arguably it's working out enough like this is part of both training and like on the job development that they're starting to send him around to do stuff they don't want to do. So that makes sense too.
Yeah. I'd flip it the other way around. It's like when you catch the kid smoking or chewing tobacco, then you make them smoke the whole pack until they grow up. And oh God, then they're going to learn. And that's why the Time Lords did that to the Doctor. They're like, okay, you wanna fix everything? Go ahead and fix everything. We'll teach you a lesson. But the Special Intervention Agency does poke a hole in that headcanon.
I mean, this brings up an interesting point because, before the War Games, like the Doctor was incredibly secretive about his origins and, just like, didn't really talk about this at all. And suddenly he's like, oh yeah, Time Lords, right, that's my people. Like, I'm one of them. Yep, here's another one. He's popping up every week. Right. So there's a marked change in the Doctor, like acknowledging where he's from. Do you think that's because it's now out in the open because of the War Games?
Well, and he's vulnerable. He's stuck on Earth. He doesn't have any choice but to rely and become part of that establishment because he needs people around him.
Mm-hmm. And the Time Lords keep reappearing, and they keep interfering with him too. They pop up to give him orders here and there, at least a couple of times in season 7 for sure. And
Colony in Space,
Terror of the Autons, they do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then Colony in Space,
Man in the
as well.
bowler hat shows up. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say. It's that their presence is more notable. And then it also, I think from just the real world perspective, becomes a thing of having opened that can of worms now with his background. I think they're enjoying the idea of playing with that a bit more and saying, all right, let's see how this works. What are the Time Lords and how does this function to get him eventually heading in a direction that they know get him back off Earth again. So there's sort of a motivation to explore that a little bit. And obviously bringing the Master in means you're inherently delving into his past now.
Yeah, I mean, I think before his exile, right, the Doctor would just sort of describe himself as like, a wanderer or something like that. And he can't do that anymore. So I think he sort of has this little crisis of identity. So I think this teenage analogy is really apt, actually, because he's having to figure out who he is now because he can't do the thing that he was before. And so, yeah.
Well, and one of you described the relationship with Jo Grant becoming kind of father-daughter as time goes on, but there's a certain element of fandom that sees a lot of shipping there. And again, there's Jo Grant's his teenage crush.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and she just flat out tells him that at the end in Green Death, where it says like, he's like you, but he's accessible.
Not so hideously old. But aside from that,
I mean, that's just blatant.
And that's one of his growing up moments as a teenager is at the end of Green Death. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the Fourth Doctor is the first Doctor in my headcanon who gets a girlfriend. That fits with my headcanon is that it kind of falls apart toward the end of the classic era, but it's all about one character aging and growing older and sort of becoming a grown-up over time. He doesn't do that until maybe the Fifth Doctor, where he becomes the head of a family unit, becomes the father of that group.
Sure. And John Hurt points out to us in Day of the Doctor that David Tennant and Matt Smith are the midlife crisis doctors. So,
yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. And another thing I was thinking about with this season as well, I want to say this is the first season they really started using the CSO for special effects as well, which I know Barry Letts really pressured the BBC to get this technology to be able to expand the special effects work on the show at a reasonable cost. And I don't remember there being any in season 7, so I'm really thinking Terror of the Autons.
They do there's the dinosaur in the Solarians, but not much else. But it's kind of like a news program, right, where they just have a screen and it's just there. It's not really interacting much. Whereas they start to really interact. From
in retrospect, they really smack you in the face with it in Terror of the Autons.
They really do.
Everything is CSO'd. Her living room is CSO'd. It's just you can't go. And in a way, though, that also helps that division we're talking about. It is a striking difference in visual style from 7. that makes you think. And not that works really well, but it's certainly like Stacey, you were saying in another panel, like we look past that, forget about the effects after a while.
Mhm.
The point is, it looks distinctly of a particular era, and that continues for a few seasons, and it really looks consistent, that
Mhm.
look. So
Yeah,
that's,
I mean, it looks
yeah.
cartoonish, and I don't say that in a bad way. Like, it really does look
Yeah.
more like it's
Yeah.
more bright and action oriented, and like more stuff's happening in a way. Whereas season 7 was much more gritty and depressing, and kind of
Yeah.
like
It had lots of chase scenes, but the chase scenes were something that you might have found in like a show about Earth policemen or firemen or something like that.
Oh, sorry, just to interrupt, we had a question in the chat saying, what is CSO? So CSO is basically green screen. It's color
Yeah.
separation overlay.
Yep.
That was the BBC's term for it. And then other organizations use different terms.
I can't remember now too. Weren't they using yellow as one of the key
Yes, yeah, they
colors
changed the
for
colors
them?
a lot.
It was
Yeah.
yellow. So we got used to using blue screen for decades, and then green became a more...
Well, they couldn't use blue screen for Doctor Who because of the TARDIS.
Right, of course.
Actually, I think they invented yellow screen on Doctor Who.
And blue became a problem in the States primarily because of weather forecasts on the news.
Mhm.
But when George Lucas was using it on the original Star Wars trilogy, it was definitely blue there.
Yeah.
Well, because the reason they chose blue originally was because it was the least like human skin tones. And so they said, like, you less, because when it's pretty bad, right? You don't want to be picking up bits of people's faces and stuff. And yes, people have blue eyes, but otherwise it was pretty far from that. But as the technology gets better, you can have more subtle divisions of color.
And it's kind of a little bit of a shame, the timing of this event and the panel, but because I assume most, if not all of you, have also seen the teaser for the Blu-ray release, the next big Blu-ray collection release is going to be this season, and I was blown away. They gave just a glimpse of, like, first of all, what I love about it is it maintains that archival thing of everything is preserved as is, but they then also have the fun sometimes. We'll do new effects and you can choose to watch that or not. That's the way to do it. But they showed like a brief glimpse of the new CGI'd version of the little troll doll, and it's stunning looking.
It is.
Because they didn't change him at all. He looks exactly as awful and stupid as he did. It's just a little smoother, that's all. And that's all I want. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a little pating, right? Yeah.
That's right.
So in Colony from space, Colony in space, they break the format, right? So we've spent almost 2 years now where the Doctor is trapped on Earth, and no matter what he does, he cannot leave. And so suddenly we're off on another planet. Is this a sign the format wasn't working?
I don't think it's a sign the format wasn't working because of how much that format basically still continues for quite a while. I think it's the case that, and I can't really recall. I mean, we've all read like 4,000 books about all this and what Barry Letts was thinking or whatever. But so I can't remember exactly how true this is, but it always seems like, well, the plan to bring him back to Earth was a stopgap for a while. It wasn't like they were going to say, this is what the show will always be forever. So the goal is we got to remind people at least a little bit, here's why you like the previous version. He travels in time and space, and then we do it a couple more times next time. And then we get to the 10th season. It's a perfect opportunity to get him out there again. And I think the point was that's part of the long-term idea. And also a way for this Doctor to have an adventure that's more like what people might have associated with the show before, to say we can still do that and explore that. And really, to some extent, Claws of Access has a bit of that feel too, because they do kind of get to that ship and they try the thing with the TARDISes. So I think that's more what it is. Certainly not a failure of the Earth-based storytelling, just the idea that they want an escape clause for later.
Yeah, I think it also gave them a chance to stretch their legs with the storytelling a little bit. And I think also because of the nature of the base of that story, Colony in Space is about a doomsday weapon, and and the effect of basically nuclear power, nuclear weapons. It's an analogy to the Cold War that was going on around Doctor Who in 71 when this was going on. To have told that story on Earth would have been a little bit too much in your face. And in fact, they sort of were hinting at it a little bit in Mind of Evil because of the conference that was going on. But yeah, it was a chance to tell that story in a Star Trek, and I mean like original Star Trek series analogy way. And in some ways, Colony in Space feels like an original Trek episode in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, only about 3 times long.
Yeah. And people really, I know that fandom is really down on Colony in Space a lot of times, but it is actually, I think, one of my favorite Jon Pertwee stories. It really is a very epic story. It's just let down a bit in the costuming, the makeup process for the aliens and the special effects of the thing. If it had been produced with, a more modern budget, it would have looked fantastic.
I also like the idea that in a way that other eras don't necessarily worry about. I don't remember again clearly. Maybe to some extent, Russell T. Davis is the next one that really tries to do this in a cohesive way. It starts to try to build more of an internal mythology and timeline for what the future is like in Doctor Who. That's like let's just tell a story, and if it contradicts the other ones,
I agree, because really they're kind of starting to establish a future Earth empire interstellar empire that we see again in Frontier in Space and the mutants and.
What's the one? Is it Mutants where he says to Jo, "This is the where she actually asks," or is it Frontier in Space? There's one where she actually asks, like, "Where are we?" And he refers back oddly, because I didn't do that too often. He refers back to the previous story and says, "Well, that was the Empire at this point. This is the Empire here." They actually were trying to place it in a timeline of there's a progression here of Earth's exploration of space and colonization of space. It's great stuff. And that really, again, that's another thing I think that really knits this era together, is you feel like you're getting a glimpse into a timeline of things that's consistent.
Well, and Doctor Who that is dabbling in some political commentary here too, I think, especially with Colony in Space. And it's certainly something that fans argue about, like, now in its current iteration, but it was definitely there in the Pertwee era, and I think probably lands squarely back with the producer Barry Letts, who was very much like-minded on some of those themes.
Absolutely. We had a panel earlier today. We were talking about that a little bit, and I think the Pertwee era is one of the strongest eras of the classic series for commentary on what was then current socio-political issues. And you can see that even in this season. I mean, you could pick out every one of them. I mean, Claws of Access is dealing with the environmental impact on feeding people and what happens when things run rampant there. And Terror of the Autons has a lot to say about the corporate world, and you could find stuff in every one of these that fits that.
Yeah, the Pertwee era especially, but even back into the Troughton era, has a lot on environmental themes as well.
And the anti-colonialism that you see in like the mutants, where Earth is definitely the bad guy and doing a lot of the things that we saw major powers doing.
And I was going to say that some of this commentary comes from the fact you've got Malcolm Hulke as a writer. He was notoriously socialist in his viewpoint of things, and brings a very different perspective to the writing. And Colony in Space is one of his stories.
I mean, you've got Malcolm Hulke, you've got Barry Letts, right? You've got very political people kind of running the show in a way. So it's not a surprise you've suddenly got this, whereas like in the late Troughton era, you've just got this sort of revolving door of people who are just kind of trying to keep the thing afloat.
Right? Just trying to get people worried.
One thing the Pertwee era I was saying earlier had really gotten me to do is having to teach myself a little bit about what the hell was going on in England at the time with mining. Because we have a lot of and there's Colony in Space, a great example, but you have that in Green Death and a lot of stories of that time too. So,
mining is the universe's greatest industry, apparently, according to Doctor Who. I did a similar thing when I was writing about the Silurians for the Black Archive I did, because it was like, you look at the energy crisis and like there were just people desperate, like we're going to run out of fuel, and like what do we do? And so there's all these stories about like, oh, we're going to have unlimited sources of energy, from this wondrous thing that's going to just plop in our laps. And of course, like this is the hope that's trying to be sort of solving all our problems. And that's
with our 2021 eyes looking back at the 1970s, it might look sometimes clunky. It might not play out in every single way that we view things, the way we view things now. But at the time, it was very, very progressive. Some of those stories, some of those things.
Absolutely.
I kind of feel like they often pulled their punches and started to make a political point with the story, but didn't really finish exploring it or got sidetracked and just went into the thriller aspects of the story fairly often. But yeah, like you say, it was one of the few eras that even bothered to get into it at all.
Yeah, and like I said, it's really strong during this period. I've been researching for the climate change panel I'm doing tomorrow, and there's a long list of stories from the Troughton and Pertwee eras on that list. And you get into the 80s and there's a lot missing on these social and environmental issues and things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Barry Letts is on record when he wrote The Green Death, he was petrified that they were going to get all these letters of complaint about it. And he said, I'm basically taking a giant risk here, really talking about these really kind of like intense political issues. So and of course what happened was the complaints were about the, pronunciation of like chitin. Yeah. But I think that shows that like he was obviously pushing in that direction, but also afraid to push too far, right? And so, I think early Barry Letts is like not quite so strident in terms of like, okay, we'll throw this in a bit, but not too much. And then it's like, okay, that's working a bit more. And then, by the end of his era, he's writing, directing, and sort of, essentially starring in Doctor Who.
But also by the end of his era, Margaret Thatcher is coming to power as well. There's a definite shift in the politics in England going on during.
I mean, she doesn't come to power till 79. So
right. But there's a rise of the Tories coming that's building during this period.
But if you look at the other science fiction shows that were on at the same time as Pertwee, Star Trek was doing political stuff all the time. The Prisoner was right around this time. The Avengers didn't deal with that stuff directly, but it was there too. I mean, there were a lot of satirical elements going into there about politics, and I'm sure you guys can think of a number of other examples.
Well, I mean, we're not very much after the Summer of Love, right? So, like, of course, there's going to be politics floating around, right? Like, that's I think not a surprise.
And it's not full tilt either, right? It's one or two stories out of a season. There might be elements that are there, and it's never like, well, it's rarely just flat out in your face. And so, and it's easy for me to say because I sympathize with the political stance that most of those episodes are taking. So I'm much more likely to embrace it and be tolerant of it. But it never feels to me like it's too preachy or it's over the top. But again, I have my biases on that.
Well, and you talked about the Summer of Love. The 60s were a time where the youth were starting to speak out more on all these issues. But it's here in the early 70s that some of them are starting to get into junior policy positions. This is the time period in which Richard Nixon, of all people, was introducing an EPA in the United States. That was 1972, I believe. So, this is happening, across the Western world at this point.
I was just thinking
West Germany,
just in terms of other things, you have like the Mind of Evil. But first of all, the other thing too is like, there's also the side that story told well, it doesn't matter whether it's commenting on something in its own present day, because it could be just as relevant today, right? And of course, we can go back to something then and say, look, the larger issues, and I think Stacey mentioned in another panel, sadly, a lot of these larger issues remain the same when you come up to 2021. But like I'm thinking, like even Mind of Evil has themes of rehabilitation of people in prison. Can that be accomplished? Well, it also technically touches on the larger issue of mental health issues and healthcare. There's a lot of stuff in these stories, and it's layered so nicely. And like you said, maybe not in your face. I have different feelings about how much that even matters. Personally, I think there's a lot of reason to be much more in people's faces with things now. But it's layered beautifully because a kid watches the show and watches the Doctor fight the Master and some aliens and stuff like that, and a slightly older person is saying, yeah, but what's also going on here is that, and it's beautifully done. And yeah, I guess it comes down to Letts and Dix and everybody else involved that they were able to do that so well, and then also tell really great adventure stories that also
But-
include those themes.
So it's funny you mentioned Dix, because Terrence Dix is, he was famously quite conservative and very, very clear about that. And so you kind of got this really political stuff happening from like Barry Letts and Malcolm Hulk, and then there's Terrence Dix who's script editing the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what actually makes it work really well, because it isn't just some polemic on one direction. Right. You behind the scenes, you've got this other guy, and he's not like he's cutting them off. He's just making the argument stronger effectively by probably providing counterpoints and stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I've never really looked too deeply into his personal life or his background in that way, but I would certainly venture to guess that we're talking about someone who's conservative in a more classic sense and not like in a far right, way.
That's not conserving anything.
That's a great balance. That's a great balance for storytelling. Absolutely. And they were a great team.
Yeah, well, even you get things like, it's a bit further on, but like when you get to Invasion of the Dinosaurs, right? It's Malcolm Hulk, but it's like, it's the left wing, like that's totally the nut jobs in there. And so, like it's not just this one directional thing. And so I really like that actually, because it lets you explore with some nuance where you get to actually sort of think about the issues and go, okay, I can make up my own mind too. Yeah. So the one story we haven't really talked about is the demons. And I think, maybe 20 years ago, the demons was held up as like, it's clearly the best of all the Pertwee stories. It's the one that, all the actors raved about and so on. And I feel like the demons has kind of undergone a bit of a shift, kind of maybe since it came out on VHS and DVD, that it's not perhaps as well loved anymore. What do we think about the demons?
I still love that story, but I do have to say that a lot of my experience of some of this era is colored by the fact that I saw it in black and white, and to me, the Demons was a black and white horror story. And I have to admit, it really works less well to me seeing it the way it's supposed to be seen, the way it was seen. And I see it in color, it still doesn't look right to me. It's like, I can't quite. So I think there's an aspect of that maybe that's affected some people. I think also there's something so familiar and so by the numbers in a sense, Doctor Who about it, that you start to drift away from it and go, yeah, okay, right. But what else have they done that maybe has also led to that? I still think it's wonderful, but I can't say honestly that I would revisit it as quickly as some of the others, even in that season, as I would have in the past.
No, I was never on the Damon's bandwagon. I mean, I don't hate the story. It's a good story, but I never put it on that pedestal that other people did. It for me, it's the weakest story of the season. So I don't know.
I guess I would agree with you that I think it's the weakest story of the season, but that doesn't make it a bad story. It just means, like season 12 or 13, that it's so hard to find weak stories in it. I don't know. I guess I wasn't really aware that people put it on the pedestal in the first place. I always thought of it as a good classic Pertwee story, but I don't know that it would make my top 10 Pertwee stories.
So I think part of it was the actors, right? Because a lot of the times they would say to, Katie Manning or, whoever, and just be like, oh, what's your favorite story? And they'd always say the Demons. And everyone's like, oh, it must be the best story. And it turned out, well, no, it's because they all got to stay in the country for like a week and live in this great hotel. And like, they had a great time. And you're like, oh, right, so of course they're going to say that's their favorite story. To me, I would say, I think there are definitely weaker stories in the season as far as stories go. I think Claws of Axos is quite flawed. And I find Colony in Space a very interesting failure. I think the problem with Colony in Space is not the alien makeup, it's the fact that it's really boring. And the thing is, I'm totally on board for the arguments. I'm like, I love this political stuff. I'm all over it. I'm like, I am struggling to keep awake in these 6 episodes. So the Demons for me is kind of middle of the road as far as the season goes. But it's kind of there, I think. Whereas the other ones, even the ones that are noticeably worse for me, have so much more interesting things going on. And like we've been talking about, like they bring up all these other issues that we can talk about for ages. And the Demons is like, okay, yeah, it's, devil worshippers in a village. Sure. I got nothing else.
It's Doctor Who doing Hammer, and and that's
it very much is. Yeah.
I wonder if that's maybe one of the reasons that it feels it was riffing on an older style of storytelling, an older motif that other people had already explored, and which didn't really continue that much past that era. I don't remember when.
Well, and the demons, like Canine and Company later on, is very steeped in the British pagan traditions from centuries past. That is, I think, frankly, a bigger deal to Native Brits than it is to those of us in the States that didn't grow up with that experience. It's not part of our culture experience here.
Anybody else remember that the short series Children of the Stones?
Yeah.
Right.
I'm aware of it.
And that was another one that's like it's a stone circle and the entire little village. And of course, Hot Fuzz, I think, beautifully nails every aspect of that kind of thing. Not again, like any good satire parody, not in a way that isn't affectionate toward it, because they obviously love that stuff. But it's like that's that thing that I agree with Michael. It's like that is very distinctly a British thing. Everybody evidently thought that there was an evil satanic cult like working around the corner of their bucolic village. And it's like, and there's something charming about that, but once you've seen it once, it's like it's just a riff on that same story.
Yeah. Well, it was also a very early 70s thing, because you had the
the Wicker Man came out in 71.
The Wicker Man, the Wicker Man and the Stone Tape.
Even Quatermass was dipping into this, I think.
Yeah, Quatermass,
and all the
stuff
I remember as a kid, all the stuff going on. I was watching In Search of, and all the stuff, now everybody says cryptids, and, we're watching about Bigfoot and Loch Ness, but also there's tons of stuff about Nazca lines and ancient astronauts and all that. It all kind of fits together, this idea of ancient evil. And of course, that would still be very much a part of Doctor Who's DNA. Image of the Fendal is a great example of that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely of that period. Well, there's a whole lot of Tom Baker around that time that's steeped in Gothic horror. So,
what I appreciate about the demons is how they turn it back into a science thing, right? Like you get to have your cake and eat it too. They live within the real physical world, but yet it is kind of about black magic and all these things. It's just a different form of science that the demons are using and utilizing.
Yeah, I will, as much as I love the story, I will always have a problem with the fact that at the very end, what are we supposed to think? Is all of some kind of robot all of a sudden who cannot handle something he's not programmed to? It was a weird resolution for that final thing where he starts doing does not compute kind of stuff.
I mean, there's a lot of humans who can't handle things when you point them out to them.
One thing I wanted to note on the Claws of Axos, I believe that was the first Doctor Who story from Bob Baker and Dave Martin, who would go on to give us many other great things. But you talk about flaws, it was their first story for the show. Robert Holmes started with the Space Pirates, but look at the wonderful things he did later on. So I think they did a decent job for a first story. Later on they gave us the Mutants and the Hand of Fear and others. So
I like Claws of Axos. They gave us both.
I do.
Yeah, I think Claws of Axos, I think, is their strongest story.
And I think the ideas are great, right? The like Baker and Martin come in with amazing ideas all the time, right? And pretty much every one of their stories, you're like, oh my god, these are huge things happening. But I think
it has to rein it in.
And I think it's difficult to. I think it was difficult for the production team to write 6-part stories. Like they almost invariably feel like they're too padded, whereas 4-parters tend to be a bit more brisk and pop better. And I wonder sometimes if that's what works against things like Colony in Space or other shows. I mean, Mind of Evil, I've never felt it on that one, but there are definitely 6-parters where you watch and you think, oh, this would be a cracking good like 4-parter instead.
Yeah, Mind of Evil, I don't think is that suffers from the 6.
Oh yeah,
no,
I agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah. It really works well as a 6-part.
The Colony, I could easily see you could cut that down to 4 and it would help it enormously.
Or because I agree with Stacey on the pacing and Colony. Imagine it reimagined for the modern series. Single episode format. It could really quite work well.
Yeah.
In fact, there's almost a psychic paper moment in that story. So, with the way the Doctor is, faking being, the Earth ambassador or whatever that was supposed to be coming. Yeah.
That's okay. The adjudicator will be here soon.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. So can we have summing up thoughts about season 8 as a whole? Michael Rogers, why don't you start?
I've said everything I feel about season 8. I love it. I'll kind of riff on this. I'm really looking forward to the Blu-ray season set that comes out. I'm very curious to see how they go about restoring Colony in Space, which I would love to see in a better looking format. I'm very anxious to go back and revisit each of those stories and see how they look in that up-res Blu-ray and the ones that are getting the fresh restoration. So to me, that's really exciting that we're going to get to dip into that just next month, hopefully, for the UK release.
Cool. Zecca?
While we do have some bigger hits coming down the road, this season really set up the Pertwee era well. It's pretty consistent, and as we said before, it really sets the tone for the next 15 years of the show in many respects. So yeah, it's brilliant, and you can't go wrong with Roger Delgado in every story. The man can just chew scenery like anyone.
Oh, Chris?
I think just to kind of piggyback on what you guys have just said, season 8, season 7, for as much as I love it, it really did have a different kind of tone than earlier Doctor Who, and season 8 made the show fun in a way that season 7 wasn't trying to do. Season 7 was trying to provoke you, make you scared, maybe in a way that was more straight horror than it was kind of the thriller aspect that we kind of expect from Doctor Who. Season 8 just leaned way back into those elements. And, obviously it worked for the benefit of the show down the road.
Cool. Arnold?
I think everybody's said just about everything I would say, and we've covered a lot in this hour. I love that season in particular. It's never really occurred to me until doing this panel with all of you how much I've probably revisited the stories in that season, maybe more than almost any other season of the classic show. So it's definitely a place of comfort and familiarity and joy for me, going back to that. And as crazy as it is to say, when you're talking about like a murderous psychopath, the presence of Delgado's master definitely is part of that family, and it's wonderful revisiting that family again, from the Brigadier to Joe to Benton, Yates, all of them, the Doctor. And it is a comfort factor to that that's almost unmatched to me.
Right. Yeah. So for me, actually, I'm kind of the opposite of the rest of you, because I love season 7 so much, and there's a part of me that mourns the loss of season 7 into season 8. Even as I can acknowledge that, it did great things for the show. Without it, there probably wouldn't be a show. There's all kinds of cool things happening, but oh man, you had season 7, this jewel in the crown of Doctor Who, and you're like, oh, let's toss that away. There's a bunch of CSO,
Who wants more Inferno, right?
yeah, exactly. Or more Silurians, or it's like, yeah. So I mean, but sometimes you only catch lightning in a bottle occasionally, and I think the key to an ongoing show is that you have to be able to replicate it. And I think season 7 was not really replicable, whereas season 8 really is. And because I think even as we're talking, where but in season 9 this happens, and in season 10 and so on, it really does set a template that and in some ways we're still following, right? And so not for the plot ways so much, but I think that Doctor Who is a big, bright, entertaining show, right? It really takes off in season 8, and we followed that ever since, I think. All right, so I'd like to thank you all for participating. So if you're watching this, please like our video and subscribe to the page. Console Room is happening virtually, January 15th through January 17th. You can find out all the things that are happening by visiting www.console-room.com. And after we end, there will be a t-shirt advertisement. If you would like to buy a t-shirt, the Console Room t-shirts, they look pretty funky. So yeah, stay tuned, and that will flash up, I believe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.